a common piece of writing advice is that you should just get the first draft down. I disagree with that. I mean, I think it's good advice for new writers who just haven't written sort of 100,000 words before and don't know what that process is like. But for me, certainly, if I wrote sort of 100,000 words that I was unhappy with, I would lose all interest in the book and, would go into a slump. So by the time I get to something that I'm going to call a finished first draft, I want it to be reasonably high quality. I know some writers don't like the actual act of writing, but they say, I don't know who the quote comes from, but I don't like writing, but I like having written, I think is something that gets said quite often. And I mean, if you're putting a lot of effort into the sentences, then, you get that feeling of having written at the end of each sentence, right? I mean, if you can look back on a sentence and think, I'm very happy with the choice of metaphor I used there or the line of dialogue, then you get that constant sort of feeling of having written something and that constant reassurance. And that's what, for me, makes the actual act of writing enjoyable. It is the feeling of having written, but that works on a kind of sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph level.
Hello, welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. My name's Dan Simpson. This is the podcast where we take a look inside an author's working day. We learn some tips, we learn some tricks from the very best to see how they plan everything to give you the best chance of doing the same. This week, we're with Alex Pavesi. Alex's debut, 8 Detectives, was a long time coming. He'd wanted to write since he was 15 years old. He would try, get an idea, write a few thousand words, get a new idea, get distracted, stop writing, give that a go, and the whole cycle would rinse and repeat endlessly. Until finally, he had an idea for a new way to tell the story. That became the debut, 8 Detectives, and it did well. It became a hit. It was a Sunday Times Crime Book of the Year. Now, he's followed that up with Ink Ribbon Red, which is just a gloriously mind-twisting tale that really changes how you thought murder mysteries needed to be written. So it's partially inspired by the TV show Friends. It's about a group of old mates that know each other through being brothers and sisters and uni friends and that scattered way that you make friends as you become an adult. And every year they meet for a birthday trip hidden away in the British countryside. And they end up playing a parlour game where they write their own very short murder mystery stories, where one member of the group will end up killing another, and then another. But what happens where in the novel, actual murders start happening? Can you figure out what's real, what's fake in the fake? It gets brilliantly meta as you try and work out not just who the actual murderer is, but what the actual killing was. It's a lot of fun. Alex has come up with an incredibly ingenious way of telling a story. I'm a slow reader, and I cracked it out in just 3 days. There's something so intricate, but also there's a page-turning thriller in there too that I think you'll love. Now, if you enjoy this show, if you get a lot of tips and advice from Alex, remember there are over 300 of the world's greatest writers sharing how they do things in our Writer's Routine podcast. And let's get into it then with Alex Pavesi, and we start as we always do with what he sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
Okay, well, so I've just moved house. In fact, just bought my first house. So I have a brand new office, which is lovely and big at the moment, quite sparsely furnished. So I have 2 desks. I have a sitting desk and I have a standing desk. And I have a bookshelf, which you can see behind me. And then some junk that is to be sorted, and some boxes in the corner of the room, as you do when you move house. But I want an armchair, which I use for reading, which I guess technically counts as work, since I'm a writer.
Well, Alex, I know that you're writing full time now, so it's an exciting moment where you're doing that. You've got another book out. You've just bought a house, with a slight luxury in almost being able to pick the right office and the right writing space for you. I mean, you're quite early on, so I don't know. It's not like you've got 20 million in the bank that you can curate the perfect idyllic writing library. But when you were buying your house, knowing that you were going to work and write there, what did you want your writing space to be?
I wanted quiet and I wanted privacy. I spent the pandemic writing from home with my girlfriend, also working from home in the same space. And I find even having someone else moving about in my eye line destroys my ability to concentrate. So I ended up going to, once restrictions had relaxed, I ended up going to a nearby library to do my work instead. And obviously there are visual distractions there, and then there's noise. But I don't know, when it's not targeted at you, it's less distracting somehow. It's more kind of background noise. But I kind of live in the middle of nowhere, so I was spending a lot of time walking to the library, and I wanted somewhere I could just work at home. So the main things were quiet and privacy. So I have my own room, and we live on a very sort of leafy kind of a development, I suppose, 1960s housing development near the river. So you never hear anything, can't even hear any cars go by, which for me is perfect.
And with your writing space, you've published quite intricately plotted murder mysteries. Do we see echoes of that around you? So you've mentioned the armchairs, the books behind you. Is there any plotting material, Post-it notes?
No, I don't actually do that. The sort of cliche of the wall of red string and things. I've never really done that. I don't know if it's just the way my brain works, but I think maybe I'm quite good at sort of visualizing complex information internally without having to put it up somewhere. So, I mean, I have notebooks and I take extensive notes and I write down ideas in notebooks, but I never at any point sort of map anything out. That all just happens in my head. And sometimes on paper, but I've never done the thing of putting stuff up on the wall.
The notes that you're making, how complex and personal are they? I mean, if I were to find your notebook, if I were to open a page at random, would I understand anything that's written there? Would I even be able to make out if it's a sentence, if it's a scrawl, if it's just a random stream of consciousness or not?
You probably wouldn't be able to understand them, and you probably wouldn't be able to read my handwriting, to be honest. I intentionally use a gel pen, 0.3 millimeter, to get technical, which is about as fine an impression as you can make with a pen. And I intentionally write extremely small, so that, I mean, the reason I do this, so sometimes I'm actually writing out text, line by line. You could call it a first draft. When I'm doing that, I don't want the temptation to go back and edit and make changes. So I intentionally write extremely small with no paragraph breaks, just making a big wall of text, which I can just about read. I think even if I came back to it myself sort of a year later, I wouldn't be able to read it, but there's enough of it stuck in my memory that I can read back what I've written. And, when I'm writing notes, obviously there's less of an issue about refusing the temptation to go back and edit, but I tend to write in the same style. So you'll see a page split up into little boxes and different areas of space, which will be filled with tiny, tiny text. I think that's just continuing the habit from when I'm actually writing out full sentences, and trying to be economical with space. It's good to have the whole thing on one page in front of me. I usually use letter paper, sort of old-fashioned letter paper for this, which is actually quite hard to get hold of these days. I remember going to W.H. Smith, 20 years ago. There'd be loads of different brands of letter paper. Now you've got basically their own brand, which is of questionable quality, and then Basildon Bond, which is still going strong, but that's about £8 now for 40 sheets, so 20 pence a sheet, but which is a bit too much. So, but that's what I prefer, just plain white paper, no markings, not too big. And I like to have as much as possible on one page so that I can sort of survey the whole thing. So I guess that's another reason I write quite small and quite messily. So I think if you found it, I don't think you'd get very far understanding it before you gave up in frustration, to be honest.
It's what I love most about doing this is the answer to a fairly standard question has given that answer, and now it's given me so many more questions. But like so when you're going shopping for this very specific writing paper, it's interesting that it needs to be that. Like, will market forces, will capitalism that dictates maybe this paper goes forever, we will never write by hand, will that kill off your romance of writing longhand to start with for a bit, perhaps?
I mean, maybe. What I've thought about doing, which would probably be cheaper, is buying sort of just plain printer paper and cutting it in half. And then you've got roughly the same thing as what I use. It's probably a bit thinner, and the pen would probably leak through a bit more of a problem. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't written a letter myself for some time, and I don't know who's really buying letter paper to write letters these days. I suppose some people still are. It's a shame that that's dying off, but it does seem inevitable, especially now stamps are very expensive. So it's actually it's quite a costly hobby to write letters to people.
It's that practice, that habit of yours is quite like intricately unique. So you need to do it with this specific gel pen, which I promise you, I don't think I've heard the word gel pen in about 15 years. It's the 0.3 millimeter or whatever it is. It's incredibly fine. And I've spoken to like over 300 authors now. No one's done that. No one's done it quite precisely like that. What made you land on that way of starting, that way of getting notes down in a very fine way so that you won't be tempted to go back and edit it later?
Yeah, I do actually have a very sensible answer to this. So, I mean, I wrote my first novel. Well, I published my first novel age 37, I think. I started writing it, I think I was 35. And, I'd wanted to be a writer since I got into literature, which was later than some people, but still I was about 16, 17. So I'd wanted to write a novel by that point for almost 20 years, and I hadn't done it. And the reason I hadn't done it is because I'd started so many things, and I'd get not even halfway through, just sort of 5,000 words in, and I'd start revising and going back, and then I'd focus on some other idea that caught my attention. And it was really a problem of just continuing with a project to the end. And I thought if I could actually, when I was 35, I thought, okay, I'd like to have written a novel before I'm 40. So if I can, find some different method that helps me actually finish a project that I start, that would be a good thing. So I decided I was going to write freehand, pen and paper. I was going to go to coffee shops before work, at least an hour every morning, and force myself to just continue with a project until it was finished. And I thought, if I took my laptop to a coffee shop, there'd be 1,000 distractions. So I'll take pen and paper, and I won't allow myself to sort of read back what I've written or try and edit it. So I'll write as small as possible. And so this is how I wrote my first book, my first finished book and my first published book, 8 Detectives. It was in coffee shops for roughly an hour every morning before work, sometimes at lunchtime too, writing it out with pen and paper. And the reason I did that was just to make it easier, or to make it almost impossible to sort of stop after 5,000 words and start going back to what I've written and changing it and thinking about other ideas. It was a kind of constraint that helped me focus, I suppose.
What's amazing is that's the position I am in.
Okay.
I mean, I've started a podcast as opposed to actually writing the book that I want to do so much. Like, I've got so many questions about it. So at what point did you realise this is working, this practice of going to coffee shops and doing it by hand every day, it might result in a novel, and you can feel that stamina that you're not doing other things? At what point did that become quite clear to you?
So I was quite lucky. I mean, I didn't think about this. This wasn't intentional, I suppose, but I was quite lucky in my choice of first novel. So 8 Detectives is a crime novel, but it's sort of halfway between a novel and a short story collection, in the sense that it's about an author and an editor. The author wrote some crime stories when he was a young man, and they meet on a Greek island where he now lives, and they discuss. So the editor's planning to republish his old collection of crime stories, and they discuss them, and there's some mystery in his life. But it also, the stories are included in the book, word for word. So, more than half the word count is taken up with these short stories. So to begin with, I wrote the stories first before I wrote the framing narrative. So to begin with, I was just writing short stories, which meant that sort of once I'd, got to 8,000 words, say, I'd finished something that I could then read back. And I guess each story took me between a month and 2 months. So after sort of a month of giving up a lot of free time to go and write, I had something that I could read back and sort of decide whether I thought it was working or not. And so I wrote the stories that appear in the book do not appear in the order that I wrote them, but I did write the first story first, which is still my favorite story in that book. So, which the first chapter of the book, if anyone reads it. About maybe 2 months into writing it, I'd finished the first draft of that, and I was pretty happy with it, and I was feeling quite positive, and that gave me the boost, I suppose, to continue to the end.
So just before finishing that, before finishing that first draft, or maybe this moment came a little later, you've had a few goes over almost 20 years of wanting to be a novelist and writing and getting new idea syndrome, or getting snuffed out by the baggy middle. And I know that we've all been there. When you push through that, when you can see that the finish line is in sight, how are you feeling then? Is it a touch of nerves? It's like, oh Christ, I can't fall over now. What's going through your brain at that point when you know that actually this could get done?
Oh, I would say that's purely positive, that stage. I get pre-publication nerves. My next book is coming out 2 weeks from the time we're speaking. So, yes, this is a nervous time. But when it's close to the end of the writing stage, for me, that's just pure exhilaration. I'm usually, I'm quite a perfectionist, so I won't let anyone read anything. I won't consider anything finished until I'm quite happy with it. So, and I'm also quite a planner. These days, at least, I'm quite an intense planner. So I don't really write anything until I've got a very clear idea of what I'm going to write, and I'm happy that it's going to work. So yeah, no, it's purely positive for me getting to the end of the project. I'm just looking forward to the break and doing something else and watching some films again and playing some video games and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm really interested to talk about how the second novel was different to writing the first, and we'll get to that in just a bit. The show is Writer's Routine, Alex, so take us through yours. A day in the life of you writing your novel. You've already said, well, you can't watch films, you can't play video games. So how does the whole thing look when you are writing a novel? Just take us through the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I get up at about 7:30. I usually read for an hour, first hour of the day, and then eat breakfast, drink a lot of coffee. I start working, or what I would call working, about 9 a.m. I try and do 9 to 5. And then really depending on what stage I'm at with the book, I might go to a coffee shop nearby for the first sort of 2 hours, or I might not. Generally, planning I prefer to do in coffee shops, and certainly if I'm writing if I'm at the stage where I'm typing something up, I won't go to a coffee shop. I know obviously it's very normal, but I get far too self-conscious sitting in a coffee shop with a laptop, so I never do that. I get paranoid that someone's looking at my screen from behind, that kind of thing. So if it's pen and paper work, I might do it in a coffee shop. I live in slightly the middle of nowhere, so the nearest coffee shop is a 15-minute walk. but is relatively nice. So yeah, either I'll do that or I'll just go straight to sitting down. I usually begin the day in the armchair, although I have a standing desk and a sitting desk. I'm not as disciplined as I should be with using those. So yeah, when the day is still sort of uncertain, I tend to gravitate to the armchair, and I plan what I'm going to write for the day. And again, get out a sheet of paper, letter paper preferably, and make my very small, intricate notes. And hopefully at some point that will become clear, and I'll have sort of an idea of what the next sort of 500 words of the book are going to be. And in the afternoon, maybe we'll move over to one of the other desks and either write it out by hand for the first draft, or, if I'm quite far along in the novel and I know what the novel's going to be, I do tend to type straight onto my laptop, or if I'm continuing something that I've already started. But I will have written sort of extensive notes that will include sort of extracts of what I'm going to write by this point. So yeah, then I do that for the afternoon. If I'm planning, I'll work the full day until 5 or 6 p.m. If I'm just putting down words, I'll tend to stop after about 1500, whenever that happens, and try not to do more than that in one day, because I think the quality probably declines if you do more than 1500 words in one day, for me at least. And yeah, then I try and relax in the evening.
I'm always quite fascinated by the idea of a work day, and that you are a full-time writer now. So in theory, you can kind of do whatever you want. Like, you want to get your 1500 words done, you could do that by 1 o'clock, and then you have the rest of the day at your luxury to watch films, to play video games. Yeah, I'm the same as you, and so many authors are. We still cling on to this idea of a 9 to 5. Why do you structure your day like that?
Well, I mean, probably the answer is because that's what my girlfriend does, and it's kind of helpful for many reasons to sync up with her. I mean, she has a salaried job. If I lived alone, I think I would probably write sort of 10 or 12 hours a day, and then have longer breaks between books, maybe. But I mean, it is very handy to have just routine. I mean, 9 to 5 is not necessarily the essential bit, but just knowing what you're going to do with the day when you wake up, I think saves a lot of time that would be spent probably procrastinating, deciding what I'm going to do with the day. So, I mean, yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, it's a nice idea that every day I'd finish my work by sort of 1 p.m. and take the rest of the day off. And maybe one day I'll find the project that is easy enough to write that I can actually do that. But I've worked out that about 1500 words, at least in first draft form, takes me at least until 5 p.m.
Are they 1500 pretty perfect words? Are you at a point where you're almost I know that you've planned, and we'll get to the planning, but you've planned quite thoroughly. So are those 50? Are you just kind of getting down anything because you want to get the word count that you can then refine through edits?
No, I have done that. I mean, I think it's actually a common piece of writing advice is that you should just get the first draft down. I disagree with that. I mean, I think it's good advice for new writers who just haven't written sort of 100,000 words before and don't know what that process is like. But for me, certainly, if I wrote sort of 100,000 words that I was unhappy with, I would lose all interest in the book and, would go into a slump. So by the time I get to something that I'm going to call a finished first draft, I want it to be reasonably high quality. And I mean, there are two ways of achieving that. Firstly, writing slowly and spending a lot of time thinking about what you're writing as you write it, which I do sometimes. The other thing is just sort of trial and error. So I might write 3 versions of the same chapter, getting slightly better each time. And I will do that. I won't do that after the book is finished. I will do that as I'm going along, because I want to make sure when I get to the point of the book where I've accrued 50,000 words, say, I want to feel pretty happy with them. I don't want to get to 50,000 words and think I've just written 50,000 bad words. That would kill off my momentum personally. So yeah, I try and keep the quality high as I'm going along.
It's a weird composite, I think, your day, because you said that one of the reasons why you struggled to write until you were in your mid-30s was because you didn't want to go over things. But then you've just said you will go over like a chapter 3 times to make sure you get it perfect. So there's kind of a lot of play, really, Alex.
Yes. Yes. I mean, there is. The point is, though, I suppose, the reason that I'm not contradicting myself is because I'm always writing. I mean, as long as I write 1,500 words a day, or obviously many days I don't write that much, but as long as I write, say, 500 words a day, aiming to write 1,500, maybe the average was somewhere between the two. I'm okay with going back over things as long as I don't stop writing. The problem before I wrote my first novel was that I would get to sort of 5,000 words and then I would just stop and think, and I wouldn't keep writing. So I do think keeping writing is quite essential. Obviously, there are times when you just don't know what's going to happen next and you need to take some time to think about it. But when you're actually in the writing stage, I think you do need to be writing. And as long as you stick to that, I think you'll be all right. It doesn't matter if you're sort of rewriting the same paragraph a few times. I mean, obviously, there are people that could get carried away with that and could write the first chapter, 100 times and never get beyond that. But that's not been a problem for me. Usually, at the most, 3 times would be enough.
You mentioned the aim is 1,500 words, but you might get to 500 or 700, and that might be okay. How do you know that you're not going to get close to your 1,500? So when you've done 500, how do you know that maybe it might be time to call it a day?
I don't think I'd intentionally stop after 500, but if those 500 have been difficult, then and it's getting to sort of the end of the day, then I will stop. I don't think I'd ever sort of. Well, I don't want to give the impression that I'm constantly writing, because I do spend a lot of time thinking about things. So I'm not sort of. So there is a mix. It's not like every day I'm sitting down churning out words. So I will stop before I've got to 1,500, if I need to think about what happens next. I do like to, maybe we'll get on to planning in more detail later, but I generally, there are multiple stages of planning. And I guess the final stage of planning would be, what's going to happen in a chapter. How does it break down paragraph by paragraph? And at some point you just run out of road and need to stop and think the next chunk.
Well, let's get to that now then. We'll talk about the new novel, Ink Ribbon Red. Hey, in just a bit. So when you and the actual genesis of that, when you have an idea, I guess talk us through the beginning, the inception of planning that, how long you'll take, the different methods of planning and stages before you will get to write that first sentence. How does that journey look?
So it has been slightly different for each book. I personally think, for me, the more time I spend planning, the better. But psychologically, there is a voice in your head that says, or in my head at least, that says, if you spend 6 months planning, if you've been working on a book for 6 months and you haven't written a word, you've just been planning, then, you're wasting your time. You're not being productive. I don't think that's actually true. I think I write quite complicated books, and the more I plan them, the easier they are to write. So I think I might even be saving time in the long run by planning up front. So as I've gone through each subsequent book, so I'm currently writing my third, I suppose, or the one that will probably be published as my third. And I'm actually, I'm about 5 months into planning it now. And I feel like I have the freedom to do that. Whereas with my second novel, Ingrid and Red, the one that we're discussing, that I probably should have spent more time planning that. I think I spent about 3 months planning it and then thought, I have to start writing. But, I was writing that under contract. I had a deadline that was psychologically very different. So, yeah, I mean, I think as I go on, more and more of my writing time is going to be planning and less actual writing. So I think for me, you're looking at around 6 months of planning. I want to know pretty much everything that's going to happen in the book before I start writing it, which is different to how other people write. I'm aware of that. But I think for me, I don't know. It's just easier to think about sort of complex plots and things when you're just dealing with sort of ideas rather than actual words on a page.
How does a day of planning look then? I don't want you to take us through it like the routine, but are you sitting there in the morning and you're going, Chapter 1, this is what will happen. Chapter 2, this is what will happen. Or are you kind of setting yourselves these puzzles that you can look over the long-term arc of the story? How does that method of planning seem when you've got characters, detectives, murders, red herrings, and all of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to answer. It changes a lot. I mean, routine-wise, it's basically the same. I'm sitting at my desk, sitting in a chair, sometimes going to a coffee shop. I do tend to go for sort of contemplative walks as well, which is something I only do when I'm planning. I mean, it's really sort of just going over the story again and again and identifying where the gaps are and then thinking about them and thinking about what you could fill that gap with. That would add something to the story. So sort of thinking murder mysteries in particular are difficult structurally because this is a genre of book that is based around sort of asking a question in the first 15% of the book and then answering it usually in the last 5% of the book. So you have this 80% in the middle, where it's just an open question what you do with that. It has to be interesting. It has to. Sometimes you read murder mysteries where it just feels like the author is treading water for the whole 80% in the middle, and that's not successful. It'd have to be a very interesting mystery to keep your attention for that long. Working out sort of where the gaps are, where there's a lull, and just. Yeah, I obviously can't describe how the thought process, how ideas come to my brain, because that's not something I have sort of oversight of. But just spending the time on it, it seems to happen.
I guess, and a question like this could lead someone to think I was accusing writers of being formulaic, and I'm not, and I'm certainly not of yours. But you describe that 80%, and there are gaps that need to be filled where maybe there's a low point. You need to pick up the pace. You need to give something. There needs to be something to do, and detective fiction well. How forced through are those ideas? You said that you don't know where they come from, but when you're at a slow point, are you thinking, okay, right, I need a red herring here. I need a bit of mystery there. And as someone who knows detective fiction, how kind of manufactured are those points at times?
For me, I don't really think in those terms. But then I don't write sort of traditional detective fiction, I suppose. Usually I'm trying to do something with my books in addition to them being sort of detective fiction. And when I sort of, as I said, Eight Detectives, my first book, had this whole sort of intertwining of short stories written by one of the characters and the main narrative. And Ink Ribbon Red, my second book, has this whole sort of layer of murders repeatedly happening throughout the narrative, but you don't know whether they're really happening or not because the characters are playing a game where they have to imagine each other's murder. So I tend to rely on sort of whatever extra element I'm adding to the detective story to kind of provide the narrative momentum, I suppose, rather than the actual detective element. So I don't really think in terms of, spacing out my clues and putting in red herrings and stuff. I guess that stuff sort of arises of its own accord naturally. I'm sort of thinking in terms of, what can I do with this slightly different take on a detective novel that I'm trying to write.
Thinking long term, how anxious are you? Because everyone is praising your novel. I mean, I'm looking at the blurb here. The Guardian says today's greatest exponent of playful detective fiction. Quirky and unpredictable. That's from the author Martin Edwards. So everyone is lauding what you write because, as you say, it's not just your standard detective fiction. There is another layer. There's another game going on. That's what you do now. That's what I imagine you will have to do for a little while. How are you feeling about coming up with more intricate ways of having a novel rather than just your standard plot?
I feel relatively confident about that, to be honest. I've always had lots of ideas. I mean, this is the thing that made me want to be a writer. I've always had ideas for stories that didn't exist. And, I remember sort of walking around the playground at primary school because I never liked football and most of the boys would play football. So I sort of walk around sometimes just sort of making up stories in my head. I've never had any shortage of ideas, so I'm not worried about that aspect. I mean, the commercial elements of publishing really is a constant worry. And I mean, I write full time, but it's sort of almost an accident that I write full time because I'd planned to change jobs. I'd been at my last employment. I was there for about 6 years, and I sort of had enough and had planned to just change get a different job. But at the time, I was under contract to write my second book, so I thought, actually, I won't apply for another job yet. I'll just write full time for a bit, and I've ended up still doing that sort of 4 years later. So, I mean, I write full time at the moment. Theoretically, I could go back into employment at some point. I don't know. I don't know what the future of publishing and book sales is commercially. How much life there will be in that. I mean, crime is a genre that has always done quite well commercially. So, and I write sort of quite different crime novels, so maybe there's room for me to continue doing that. But yes, I mean that is a constant concern. But the actual ideas, I'm not really. No, I'm fairly confident about my ability to come up with ideas, I suppose.
Let's just talk about the words on the page very quickly. You said right at the start you've been a fan of literature since you were 16 or so, and you want what you write to be as near enough first time round. If that means you have to rewrite a chapter 3 times, you'll do that. And it's very thoroughly plotted. Murder mysteries and detective fiction aren't always known for the actual prose. It's quite often the plot, the pacing that keeps us reading. How much are you thinking about the next word and how unique it is?
I mean, for me, that's huge. That's everything. That's why I like writing. I'm a big fan of good use of language, which is not saying that I am good at using language, but I aspire to be. So, I mean, I never really read books when I was young. I would occasionally read. I mean, I liked films and I liked TV. Those were my main sort of story encounters with stories. I thought books were kind of too long and a bit boring. The only books I read were really things like Star Wars, expanded universe stories, and I used to read X-Files novels. But and I read those because I liked those worlds already from having seen them on film or TV. And I didn't really get into literature until I encountered the work of the writer G.K. Chesterton, who was kind of late Victorian crime writer who had a sort of philosophical bent to his stories. But he was also a very good prose stylist. And I got into him because I liked the TV show Jonathan Creek. So again, it began with TV, but I wanted more Jonathan Creek, and there were limited episodes available. And I saw an interview with the man who wrote Jonathan Creek, who said that G.K. Chesterton was one of his inspirations. So I tracked them down, and I read some of the Father Brown stories by G.K. Chesterton, which are, very much, very much in the sort of Venn diagram overlap between crime fiction and literature. I don't think anyone could fault their kind of literary credibility, purely for the sort of prose style alone, if nothing else. He's such a strong writer with his imagery and his frankly bizarre way of looking at things. And that was, directly reading G.K. Chesterton is what got me into literature. I didn't realize before that books could do that you could use language in such an interesting way and conjure imagery that was like 1,000 times better than anything you'll get from a film or TV show. So, after that, I started reading lots of literature, and I also started reading more crime fiction. So the two things have always gone hand in hand with me. And yeah, definitely, like, that is what I want to write, something of comparable sort of impact. And in terms of sort of the process, that for me is what makes it fun. Like, I know some writers don't like the actual act of writing, but they say, I don't know who the quote comes from, but I don't like writing, but I like having written, I think is something that gets said quite often. And if you're putting a lot of effort into the sentences, then, you get that feeling of having written at the end of each sentence, right? If you can look back on a sentence and think, oh, I'm very happy with the choice of metaphor I used there, or the line of dialogue, then you get that constant sort of feeling of having written something, and that constant reassurance. And that's what, for me, like, makes the actual act of writing enjoyable. It's it is the feeling of having written, but that works on a kind of sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph level. So, if I only write 500 words in a day, but I read it back and I think, well, that's a really good, atmospheric description of a woods or whatever, then, that fills me with joy, and that's what makes the whole thing something I want to do.
It's almost a puzzle in itself, I guess, trying to figure out the perfect framing of the sentence. How often do you find those two things kind of butt heads? Your need to write a tricksy detective novel that's full of pace, that's full of mystery, that employs the standards of the genre, short chapters every now and then, that kind of thing, with also your desire to write as good a prose as you can in the form.
Yes, that is something that slightly. I spend an excessive amount of time thinking about. It's more the marketing, really. Some of my favorite crime writers, or who I would say are my favorite crime writers living, working today, their books are not marketed as crime. So, for example, I think you could make an argument that Donna Tartt, who wrote, The Secret History, the Goldfinch, etc., is one of the greatest living crime writers, but I've never seen her books shelved under crime. They're always shelved under literary fiction or general fiction. And just this sort of weirdness that I think the publishing industry has about drawing such an arbitrary line between where crime fiction begins and where crime fiction ends and literary fiction begins. I mean, they're doing it for commercial reasons and trying to sell to specific markets, I guess. But yes, I mean, that does constantly worry me. It worries me more in terms of selling my books rather than actually writing them. When I'm writing them, I just try and make it the kind of book I would enjoy. So that's a fairly easy thing to sort of get a handle on. But yes, in terms of how they're marketed, how they're sold, there's a very weird dividing line between crime fiction and literary fiction, and I'm not sure anyone would be able to define what the difference is. I never use these terms myself. I would never really refer to literature unless I'm talking about sort of classics and the canon and whatever. But yeah.
So we've talked about the process of putting a book together. Let's make it specific with the new one then, Ink, Ribbon, Red. Alex, just tell us about the first moment that the idea for what became this layered and tricksy story came into your head.
Well, yes. So Eight Detectives, my first novel, I mentioned that it does have short stories contained within the main story. One thing that I didn't really do with that novel is blur the line between the two. So you always know, I mean, beyond the beginning where you don't know anything, beyond the first sort of 50 pages, you always know whether you're reading a story or a story within the story. And it was when I was discussing, actually, I had a number of discussions about potential TV adaptations, which, I'm not sure anything are going to happen, but I did sell the option for that book, and there were some discussions about how it could work as a TV show. And one of those discussions involved sort of the different tricks you could play on the viewer by sort of blurring this line between whether they're watching the main story or one of the stories within the story. And at some point during those discussions, I had this idea that you can make a whole mystery, a sort of murder mystery that revolves around the question of whether at any point you're reading reality or a story within the story. And that appealed to me purely because I don't think it's been done before. And I think it was something new. And that, I'm always interested in trying new things and working out new ideas and seeing if they'll work. So that was where I began. I just had this idea of a mystery novel where the mystery was, is the stuff I'm reading really happening, or is it, story within story? And I didn't actually intend to write that when I first had the idea. I planned a different second novel. I was very naive, and it hadn't really occurred to me that my second novel ought to be, because I signed a 2-book contract. So it hadn't really occurred to me that the second novel ought to be quite similar to the first, or at least ought to appeal to fans of the first. So I was writing a second novel that was quite different from the first. And when I sort of showed an early version of this to the publisher, to my editors, they sort of said, "Oh, we expected something a bit more similar to the first book." So I went through this. I went through all the sort of. I ultimately ended up changing the book I was working on a different book, which became Ink, Ribbon, Red. But yeah, I mean, because it has that sort of link in how it evolved from thinking about the first book, I thought, okay, well, that's similar enough. Although it's quite different to the first book, it has at least one thing in common. So I switched to working on that, and that became my second book. And then I realized, this idea that I'd had that was very abstract, I had to actually turn into something readable, 80,000 words long. And that was very difficult. I mean, there was no easy way to do that. It just took me a long time and a lot of false starts. And it ended up taking longer to write than the first book, in fact, even though I had a full-time job while I was writing the first book. This one still took longer. But unfortunately, there was no easy way to do that. It was just a lot of trial and error, trying different things out, reflecting on what I was trying to achieve and whether what I'd written addressed that and so on.
When you're thoroughly planning and plotting, especially a murder mystery, I know that characters can kind of do what they want. You think you've got a grasp on them, but if you've made them three-dimensional and properly fleshed out, they might have an idea of what's happening that's far different to yours. How often have you found that happen? How hard is it to wrestle them back to where you would like this to go?
I mean, I have what is maybe a controversial approach. I mean, I always lead with the plot, and my characters are always subservient to the plot. So I will work out what a character needs to do for the purpose of moving the plot forward. And then if the character, as I've envisioned them or imagined them, wouldn't do that thing, then I'm fairly brutal and I will just change the character. So, this character that I'd imagined as quite a nice person, it turns out they need to have a murder in their past. I'll just change them to a slightly less nice person. And I mean, I don't start with the characters. For me, it's more about thinking what kind of character would do these things that need to be done to make the plot work. So I'm fairly brutal in that sense. I know a lot of authors do like to let the characters lead the way, but I do not take that position.
Do you give any length of rope to them in when you've decided, no, this is what you're doing? How do you get to know them outside of that? Do you get to flesh that out to kind of justify that decision, or do you just not care? They're doing it regardless.
Well, I mean, people in real life are very contradictory and combine different things. So it's not like I have to change them too much. It's a few crucial changes, I suppose. But I mean, it might be that I'd sort of imagined, I don't know, I'd imagined a character being similar to my mum or something, and I'd taking the mannerisms from her. Then I realized, the book would be much better if she turned out to murder someone halfway through, and then I have to go to, to my mum and say, well, I did base a character on you, but I'm afraid I made them also sort of evil and of murderous intent. But yeah, I mean, if they seem slightly inconsistent, slightly contradictory, I mean, that can be a benefit because of course people in real life are and contain multitudes. So I mean, it really, the trick is just making sure that they read as a sort of package that the reader can understand, taken as a whole. And that's a kind of, I suppose that's almost a sort of sleight of hand pulling that off. But yes, I mean, I think it can be done. I don't think you have to choose between plot and character. I think, you can have both be the way you want them to be. You might just need to sort of, I don't know, spend some time thinking about how to sort of reconcile different elements.
Last question. So you've wanted to write and be a published author since you were like in your mid-teens. So you've had a few goes at making that happen. You found yourself in a fortunate position, right, where you're 2 books down and you're a full-time author, which doesn't always happen. And you've managed to get through the tricky second book and reconcile the fact that that's often much harder and a much different prospect. So what's been the best part? What's been the worst part of being a published author?
I mean, the best part, I just love reading readers' responses. I mean, I don't read all of my reviews on something like Goodreads, but I read a fair chunk of them. I begin reading all of them until I've got a sort of idea of what people are saying. And then after that point, I fairly shamelessly only read the positive ones. So
Yeah.
I can.
I don't know why you would not.
Yeah, so I don't know. Once a month or so, I'll go on Goodreads and I'll filter to just the 5-star reviews, and I'll have a look at those, and that's a really nice feeling. I mean, it's just really surreal and fascinating to just sort of hear people talking about something that you've written, and I mean, my first book now is part of my past. It was 5 years ago. I can remember writing it, but there are bits I'd forgotten. So it's really fun to go and revisit that. I mean, the worst part, I mean, my first book came out right in the middle of the pandemic, and that was pretty awful. So I've never really got the hang of. I mean, when my first book came out, I didn't get to do any events or anything really. I did a couple on Zoom, and I did one talk at a sort of socially distanced festival. So, I mean, yes, that was the low point, I suppose. But hopefully, I mean, obviously, that's not going to happen with the second book. So hopefully that will get a lot better with this one.
And that is it for this week's episode of the podcast. Thank you so much to Alex Pavesi for coming on. That new novel is Ink Ribbon Red, and you can get a copy right now. If you'd like to get a copy, help this podcast out, help Alex out, and help your local independent bookshop out, use the Writers Routine bookshop.org website. You've got a link in the description just below. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to hear more of the very best authors explaining how they do things, you can do that. Make sure you listen to the Writers Routine podcast. Click the link here. You can search wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to this channel where we've got more of the very best writers around. And for NaNoWriMo tips every day this month, make sure you follow our Instagram and TikTok feed. Find Writers Routine there, really easy. And I will see you next time with a brand new episode of the podcast. Until then, thank you for watching.